Welcome to History Happy Hour. I'm your host, Jess Edberg, Executive Director of the Dorothy Molter Museum. The purpose of the program is to educate, inspire, and entertain with a pint-sized historical tale related to Ely area history in about the time it takes to drink a glass of your favorite beverage. Let me qualify this program by saying the history I share is not a deep dive, rather, it scratches the surface using publicly accessible resources, including online content, in person interviews, and published materials. Additionally, this program is offered as a free in person half hour event October through May, typically on the third Wednesday of the month at 5 p.m. at the Boathouse Brewpub and Restaurant in Ely, Minnesota. History Happy Hour is supported in kind by the Boathouse Brewpub, Ely's Heritage Preservation Commission, the Dorothy Molter Museum, Boundary Waters Connect, the Ely Folk School, and Ely Trivia Night. This program, we're going to take a look at the Civilian Conservation Corps, a New Deal program intended to help lift the United States out of the Great Depression. It was the pet project of new President Franklin D. Roosevelt to enlist single men between the ages of 18 and 25 to work projects to improve America's public lands and provide a living wage to devastated families from around the country. This program, the CCC, or sometimes the Cs, for many, was a lifeline they had been desperate for. The prospect of 3 meals a day and a bed was enough to attract workers, but the added wage of $30 a month was a miracle. I think we can all conjure up images of what the Great Depression represented from what we learned about it in grade school, for sure. The great stock market crash of 1929, that is often blamed for the start of it, may also bring up dark imagery. However, the Great Depression wasn't a ready, set, go situation. Most folks may not even be aware it was a worldwide era. The Great Depression lasted approximately 10 years and affected both industrialized and non industrialized countries in many parts of the world. The initial factor was the global financial upset created by the First World War that led to less flexibility for the US in domestic and international markets and made the US less resilient to the financial shocks coming down the pike. It also led to an international trend in isolationism. In the US, during the mid to late 1920s, there was a rapid expansion in the stock market. During the first 6 months after President Herbert Hoover's inauguration, stocks reached fantastical heights in what was called the Hoover bull market. Everyone from banking and railroad magnates to their own paid help wanted in and invested everything. They sold their Liberty bonds from World War I, mortgaged their homes, and used all liquid assets. And even in light of an economic recession that began during the summer, by September 1929, 300 million shares of stock pushed the Dow Jones Industrial Average to a peak of almost 400 points. It continued with rampant speculation fueling ongoing spending into October until the 18th, when the market went into freefall and the wild rush to buy stocks gave way to an even more urgent rush to sell them. The first day of tangible panic is known as Black Thursday, October 24th. A record 12.9 million shares were traded, and banks, along with investment companies, scrambled to offset the decline by buying great blocks of stock to shore up the market. True panic began the following week with a Black Monday and a Black Tuesday when stock prices went into freefall. At first, political and financial leaders tried to smooth things over with the reassurance statements like, "We're fundamentally sound," or "It's a mere spasm," and the most comforting, "Prosperity is just around the corner." Needless to say, those platitudes did little to stem the panic. A perfect storm of financial ruin had come to roost. The worst depression ever experienced by the global economy certainly stemmed from the stock market crash of 1929 and the increased isolationism after World War I. But it was also fueled by a decline in consumerism, clinging to the gold standard, which ironically had historically linked nearly all the countries of the world in a fixed currency, and an ill conceived attempt to balance the federal budget, including the Smoot-Hawley Act, which imposed tariffs by an average of 16% to shield American factories from foreign competition. Here in the US, the economic impact was exacerbated by the Dust Bowl, a severe drought that began in the early 1930s. This drought wasn't just any run of the mill dry spell. It created a living hell for folks living in the Great Plains region when hot, dry, and high winds picked up the loose soil from overplowing and planting and created intense and deadly dust storms. Crop failures and livestock deaths added insult to injury during the Great Depression, leaving farmers unable to make a living, leading to food shortages and rising costs, greater economic instability, and unemployment. The proverbial silver lining in all of this hardship and death was that the widespread suffering led to social and political changes, including the development of new programs and policies. The first things folks did was elect a new president in 1932. Franklin Delano Roosevelt began serving in January 1933 after a storied career in both political and military roles and becoming paraplegic due to illness. He's the only president to have served more than two terms, four. Of course, the 22nd Amendment was passed in 1951, establishing presidential term limits. Roosevelt's big plan took form as the New Deal, a domestic program of the administration between 1933 and 1939, which took action to bring about immediate economic relief, as well as reforms in industry, agriculture, finance, water power, labor, and housing, vastly increasing the scope of the federal government's activities in daily life. Some may even call it communist socialism. The core goals of this program were to provide relief, boost recovery, and reform the financial system to avoid future economic crises. Key programs and legislation that occurred during this administration include the Agriculture Adjustment Act to reduce agriculture surplus and raise prices by paying farmers to limit production, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built dams and power plants in the Tennessee Valley, providing jobs and electricity to rural areas. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration and Works Progress Administration, or WPA, both of which provided jobs for unemployed individuals through public works projects and the arts. The National Recovery Administration, in an effort to stabilize prices and wages through industry codes, promoting industrial recovery. Social Security Act established a system of unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and survivor benefits. The Securities Act of 1933 and Securities Exchange Act of 1934 that created the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, to regulate the stock market and protect investors to avoid another stock market crash as best as possible. The Wagner Labor Relations Act that guaranteed workers the right to organize unions and bargain collectively. Fair Labor Standards Act, which set a minimum wage, a maximum work week, and restricted child labor. And the guest of honor tonight, the Civilian Conservation Corps, a federal work relief program, which was Roosevelt's baby. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with the outcomes of the New Deal. Consider those whose town and home ended up under 440 feet of water in Tennessee. But for others, especially farmers in the heart of the US, the CCC was a lifeline. Tens of thousands of young men came from all over the US and all sizes of cities and towns and from all walks of life to live in quasi-military camps, often in remote settings, to support their families and contribute to the regeneration and beautification of the nation. Throughout the tenure of the CCC, more than 2.5 million men had served in more than 4,500 camps, planting over 3 billion trees, combating soil erosion and wildfires, stringing electrical lines, building parks, and helping with natural disasters. Getting Roosevelt's dream off the ground took a bit of negotiating with Congress. His March 21, 1933 proposal called for the employment of 250,000 men by early summer, and it held broad discretionary authority for the president in setting up an emergency conservation work program, which officially became the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1937. Roosevelt had the vision, but he relied on two pragmatists, personal assistant Louis Howe and the man appointed the first director of the CCC, Robert Fechner. To many, Howe was not the type of man expected to be the right hand man of the President of the United States. Instead, he was described as fragile, small in stature, sickly, and disheveled in appearance, and clearly bullied by the press, who referred to him as ghoulish and a medieval gnome. However, he was incredibly loyal to Roosevelt and took the insults with humor. He was, in truth, one of the most influential characters in the making of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's political careers, and perhaps most widely known under the title Kingmaker. Fechner's background and appearance was less criticized. As a longtime official with the Machinists Union, his appointment strategically garnered support from the labor leaders. As a nobody in the conservation community, he quickly earned respect for his strong work ethic and administrative competence. By the end of March, this dream team got Roosevelt's CCC proposal signed into law, and the task of setting up the practical application of the program from scratch had begun. The $1 per day wage scale that wasn't well received by the organized labor movement even passed muster, and concessions to allow Black and Native Americans were made. But although the 14th Amendment outlawing racial discrimination for federal work programs was in place, segregation was not defined as discriminatory, and segregated camps were designed. Thousands of public employees worked long days through weekends to get the CCC program launched by the president's summer goal. It was a monumental achievement when it all came to fruition, because it wasn't just a radically new concept and organizational structure, it was a wholly new administrative apparatus with detailed policies, including a recruitment matrix and a project management strategy, not to mention smaller issues like uniforms, employee expectations, and meal provisions. The CCC worked closely with state relief agencies to determine eligibility of workers, who then had to promise to send home between $22 and $25, the majority of their $30 monthly wages, so their families could spend the money and contribute to the economic recovery of the nations. The projects were supervised by the U.S. Forest Service, part of the Agriculture Department, and the National Park Service, part of the Department of the Interior. Both agencies had been preparing projects, and the National Park Service invited state park representatives to collaborate with projects on state park lands. For state park projects, the main rule of thumb was to keep it simple and focusing on facilities with easy access, good water sources, and sanitation. This wasn't for building summer homes. This was for cheap tourist cabins that were likely more labor intensive rather than elaborate structures that would have been even more expensive and elaborate to maintain. The philosophy may be why so many CCC built structures around the country are still in use today. The Army had been developing plans to construct camps for unemployed transients, which they then rolled into the CCC plans for work camps. However, due to the lingering distaste of militaristic fascism during World War I, CCC officials from the top down wanted to minimize the appearance of the Army at the work camps. No drills, no weapons training, no saluting, and no MPs. Turns out the Army's expertise in transporting, housing, and disciplining the 250,000 young men the president wanted in work camps in 3 months' time was indispensable. And in the end, it was decided that the Army would run the 200 men work camps and have disciplinary authority over the men, but the Forest Service or Park Service would be the technical supervisors on projects in the field. Still, the Army's heavy involvement would always be a sensitive issue. Roosevelt tried to make light of it by saying, "Oh, that doesn't matter. The Army and the Forestry Service will really run the show. The Secretary of Labor will select the men and make the rules, and Fechner will go along and give everybody satisfaction and confidence." No pressure to Fechner. The first 25,000 men were selected from the 17 largest cities closest to Washington, D.C. Their families were on relief rolls, which provided social services to the poor. However, homeless and or transient men were not eligible as they had nobody to send wages home to who could then spend it in their community. Once the eligible men were selected, they were sent to 9 Army recruiting stations around the country where they first had to pass a physical to be officially enrolled as juniors. Almost 9% didn't pass the first year. Once enrolled, they were inoculated against smallpox and typhoid and sent to various Army bases for a short period of, quote, conditioning of calisthenics and light work duty. By April 17th, the first camp was in operation near Luray, Virginia. Camp Roosevelt, of course. Roosevelt also signed an executive order authorizing the enrollment of 12,000 Native Americans on reservation lands. This order waived the age and marital status requirements and allowed most to live at home than in Army run camps. Their camps and work was overseen by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and were referred to as the Civilian Conservation Corps Indian Division. Here in Minnesota, more than 2,000 Native American families benefited from not only the wages, but the learned work skills and community infrastructure like roads and wells. Over the course of the CCC, 88,000 Native Americans were employed. Shortly after the first 25,000 men were put to work, another round of selection took place. However, it didn't take long for the nearby towns close to the CCC camps to become a bit irritated that their residents weren't being offered placement. In some cases, unemployed locals took the resentment to the next level and doled out a bit of backwoods revenge through sabotage and arson. This exacerbated an already frustrating situation where field supervisors were dealing with sorely unskilled, know nothing of the woods employees and making getting the jobs done more work than anticipated. An additional executive order offered a solution by requiring the recruitment of local experienced men, or LEMs, who lived in the vicinity of the camps and had some kind of forestry experience. They could be hired without age or marital restrictions, didn't have to send money home, and didn't have to go through the CCC boot camp. This added an additional 33,000 technical workers to the CCC program that first summer. Unsurprisingly, the loosey-goosey procedure for hiring the LEMs was quickly manipulated by some congressmen via political patronage and favoritism, although this was downplayed. In the early 30s, veterans of World War I were becoming more vocal about benefits due. The bonus march of World War I veterans in 1932 and another in 1933 resulted in the Veterans Administration suggesting to Roosevelt that the CCC introduce a veteran program. The problem was that these veterans were much older, many in their 40s, and the perception was that they would slow down the work of projects and add a heavier odor of militarism to the camps. However, Roosevelt agreed and signed authorization of 25,000 war veterans selected by the Veterans Administration to work in special camps of their own with no restrictions on age or marital status. Over the next 9 years, over 225,000 veterans were selected, although their rural camps, which sold beer in the canteens, sometimes created problems for the local communities. As the CCC evolved to be more inclusive, or as inclusive as you can be in the 1930s, the one unemployed group notably missing was women. As hard as the progressive First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt tried to convince her peers that the estimated 200,000 homeless women in the country could be put to work in the forestry nurseries of the CCC, nobody, not even the first woman cabinet member, Frances Perkins, in the Labor Department, would budge. However, eventually, Secretary Perkins was worn down and helped develop Federal Emergency Relief Association camps, or FARA camps, also referred to as she camps. By 1936, there were 90 residential she or FARA camps that ultimately employed 8,500 women workers. A far cry from nearly 3 million men that participated in the CCC, which was more widely supported both by the administration and the public. Unfortunately for the thousands of destitute women working in the camps, the restrictive gender norms of the late 1930s won out by 1937, and all women's camps were closed after criticism over women at camps fraternizing with the men's camps and that the camps were a gateway to communism. That first spring, 9,000 men a day were being onboarded into the CCC. Life for new workers in the early stages of the CCC was a bit rough compared to those who came later. Many of the new camps weren't quite prepared, and men often had to begin work immediately in clearing land for their own tents. Over the first 6 months, about 10% of workers dropped out once their work requirement was up. However, many re upped for a second 6 month hitch. Games, radios, and other recreational equipment was supplied as well. Eventually, baseball, football, and basketball competitions were played both within and between camps and local residents. Many camps also publish their own newspaper, but don't even think of offering educational classes. Colonel Duncan Major, one of the early administrators of the CCC, was adamant in writing, "I have consistently fought the attempts of long haired men and short haired women to get into our camps," referring to nonconformists who he perceived to lack discipline and contradict his military style regimentation of the camps. However, some of the civilian officials in the CCC began to speak up for a more advanced educational structure, other than reading and writing for the largely poor and unskilled men, who, as First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt pointed out, couldn't really take their newfound forestry skills back to Detroit or Los Angeles. The Army realized that an education program was going to be thrust upon the CCC, so they got in front of it and developed their own preferred proposal to appoint to a director of CCC education, who would then appoint educational advisors for each camp, who would select one junior to assist them. Although 57,000 illiterate men learned to read and write at the CCC, the educational program was a bit of an afterthought, lacking any kind of system or clear cut objectives, leading to some commanders enthusiastically cooperating with the advisors and many viewing the program as an unwelcome chore outside the proper interests of professional fighting men. According to Francis Perkins, this fit into Roosevelt's MO for his management strategies: to come up with a program, rush it through, and let other, less imaginative people handle the details. Had the program been provided more structure with clear goals, it may have been a much more successful for the captive learners at the CCC camps. Regardless, the success of the work projects led to Roosevelt authorizing subsequent hitches into the winter months, requiring the camps to winterize for the workers. A power struggle ensued over who would build the housing. Ultimately, the camp barracks were contracted to local builders, most at union wages, and became the largest housing project in history. Many of these cabins are now tourist housing at many state parks throughout the country. Although Roosevelt's vision was viewed as a pie in the sky, it resulted in a program that successfully created jobs and assisted in economic recovery during a time when the United States was in dire straits. The last enrollees left their camps in 1942, just in time to trade their shovels for rifles and face the horrors of World War II, but that's another program. All in all, the millions of workers in the CCC who planted billions of trees around the country left a bright star in the history of the US during the dismal decade of the Great Depression. Today, we're still able to appreciate many of the forests, buildings, and recreational areas that the CCC worked in and built in Minnesota. Within the first year, Minnesota had 61 camps, 24 state forest camps, 10 soil erosion camps, and 3 state park camps. By the end of the program a decade later, Minnesota had 104 camps statewide. Sadly, Minnesota was not as progressive with CCC selections as one may think or hope. While the state recruited significant numbers of Native Americans, it fell quite short in enrolling Black Minnesotans. The CCC took shape under Jim Crow laws and reflected the institutional racism that dominated the area. The Army's involvement in managing the camps often reinforced this, as the military had a strict segregation policy. Additionally, Black Americans faced open hostility and racism at the hands of their white peers and supervisors, and they were often left with the worst tools, tasks, and quarters. Massive campaigns for equality by the Twin Cities Urban League and other community leaders ramped up when Black enrollees were forced to join all Black units in Southern states where Jim Crow laws were in full effect. Enrollment by Black Minnesotans dropped off significantly and created a new source of pain and oppression. It's believed that the Gagoka Camp F2, about 30 miles south of Ely, was the first to be established in the state on May 7, 1933, with a focus on forest management, and it was one of 4 in the Ely area that was integrated with several Black members when it was formed. The others were Portage River, Halfway, and Isabella camps. However, after receiving complaints nationwide from residents of towns near mixed race camps, CCC Director Robert Fechner ordered a complete segregation of colored and white enrollees. Each physical camp had an alphanumeric code that identified the main focus of the work. Most in this area of Minnesota were F camps, or those that worked on national forest lands. These camps did work for the Superior National Forest, and the work was dictated by the Forest Service. Each 200-man company was identified by a number. Some companies worked at the same camp for the duration of the CCC, and others were moved around depending on project work. Workers getting off the train in Ely were sent to any of the following F camps. Halfway Camp F1 on the South Quishrie River operated from 1933 to 38. Buildings that are still in use include the South Quishrie Campground Pavilion and the Halfway House, which was used by the U.S. Geological Survey for housing for the decades-long wolf deer research program led by Dr. Dave Meach. Gagoka Camp F2, already mentioned, operated 1933 to 37 and then 38 to 42. Isabella Camp F17 operated 1933 to 35 and was also referred to as Dunnigan Camp, not to be confused with Dunnigan Lake Camp F16, which operated from 1933 to 35. Halfway, Gagoka, Isabella, and Portage River Camp F8, which operated 33 to 41, were all integrated camps with Black Americans until at least 1935. Fensky Lake Camp F7 on the Echo Trail, also known as Spring Creek or Spring Lake Camp, operated 1933 to 34 and 1935 to 36. When this camp closed, it was sold to the Northern Lakes Girl Scout Council. This camp closed in the early 60s and is now part of the Superior National Forest, featuring Fensky Lake Campground, and the visible remnants of this early history as of 2018 are 2 stone fireplaces with chimneys that were part of the mess hall. Fun fact, did you know that a 1927 publication of the Girl Scouts called Tramping and Trailing with the Girl Scouts printed the first recipe for our favorite campfire treat, the s'more? Moving on, Baptism Camp F54 operated 1935 to 41. Fernburg Camp F44 between Ely and Virginia operated 1935 to 36. Sadly, 8 men there died in 1936 during the typhoid epidemic, and based on what we know of the CCC recruitment, it appears they may have been local men who had not been vaccinated. Cold Spring Camp F9, also on the Echo Trail, operated 1933 to 36. And the last local camp men would have been assigned was Vermilion Dam Camp F56, closer to Tower, which also had a sister camp P56 that operated on private forest land from 1935 to 37. It is possible that an E designation referred to a camp focused on erosion control, and one listed as using the Ely Post Office was Altura Camp E88, but little information was found on it. Although Minnesota was not part of the Dust Bowl, it suffered from water and wind erosion, with 46% of the state's local land area affected in that era. The closest CCCID camp, or Indian Department camp, was at Net Lake, CCCID 3. It was the first Native American camp in Minnesota to serve the consolidated Chippewa reservations from 1933 to 41. Notes by officials stated they considered this camp very striking because of its brick chimneys and painted buildings. As the program came to a close, Gagoka Camp Gunflint Camp out of Grand Marais, and Bena Camp out of Bena were the last federal forest camps to close in Minnesota from 1933 to 1942. These and the dozens of other camps around the state made significant improvements to our shared natural resources, rural infrastructure, and economy that we still value and appreciate today. After closing in 1942, although the program wasn't officially terminated, the House and Senate approved funding to cover the costs of shutting down the remaining CCC camps and divvying up its equipment and resources. Decades later, in the 1970s, in an effort to continue the philosophy of improving the land and providing work for young people, the federal government launched the Summer Youth Conservation Corps and the year-round Young Adult Conservation Corps, but funding only lasted into the 1980s and the program was discontinued. However, the Minnesota legislature took up the reins and established the Minnesota Conservation Corps through the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. In 1999, the Friends of the Minnesota Conservation Corps incorporated as a nonprofit and assumed operations of MCC in 2003. In 2009, Iowa launched its own program and merged with the Minnesota program in 2010 to become the Conservation Corps Minnesota and Iowa. Since then, the organization provides work in other Midwest states and provides youth and young adults with meaningful work and professional development through conservation projects that directly enrich and benefit all of our lives. Thank you to my sources of imagery and information, especially Kelsey Cook of the Ely Winton Historical Society, Nancy Outcalt, and Ann Euling. If you have any questions about the things covered in this show or would like to follow History Happy Hour, please find us on Facebook or Instagram. History Happy Hour is supported in kind by the Boathouse Brewpub, Ely's Heritage Preservation Commission, the Dorothy Molter Museum, Boundary Waters Connect, the Ely Folk School, and Ely Trivia Night. Local history is our shared history, and your engagement with this topic keeps it alive. I especially hope that this program helped those of you who are not directly connected to it understand and appreciate it a little bit more. Please join us next time to be inspired to learn more about our shared history.